All right, hi there, Year 11. Now, this is the second part of your Keeping Up with Lockdown video. We're going to be going through things that you have done while you've been away, but for people who might have missed lessons, this is the perfect opportunity for them to keep up with what you lot have already done. So it's going to be a brief overview of certain aspects of the course, and this video should take no longer than about 20 minutes. So for this next bit, we need to look at how Hitler reduced unemployment. We need to understand that obviously when Hitler was on his way to becoming the leader of Germany, he promised the people that he would get unemployment down. And he did this through work by promising them work and bread. And there were two big problems that Germany had in 1933. Don't forget, they'd just been through the Great Depression because of the Wall Street crash of 1929. The first big problem they had was mass unemployment. 25% of workers, which was around 6 million. And the economic depression had ruined trade, business, and production. And Hitler's main two aims were to solve the unemployment. All right, if he had unhappy unemployed people, it would reduce how many people supported the Nazis. And Germany needed workers, mainly for this second point here, to begin to prepare Germany for war. Now, one of the key plans that the Nazis introduced was in 1933, and this was by an individual called Schacht, who introduced the 1933 New Plan to solve unemployment. And they began to use a variety of methods to solve unemployment, and there's going to be four that we look at today. National Labour Service, the RAD, conscription and rearmament, autobahns and public works, and invisible unemployment. So if you have a look in the top corner, we've got the National Labour Service, and this was also known as the RAD. And this was one of the methods the Nazis used to reduce unemployment. So all young men between 18 to 25 had to join the RAD for 6 months. It was paid work to help Germany. Not very well paid, but it was paid. They were given jobs in public work, such as building schools, hospitals, planting trees, and repairing roads. The conditions weren't very good for the workers. They had to wear uniform, live in camps, and they had to parade. Many complained of low pay and poor food. So even though it got the numbers down, the standard of living for these workers was pretty poor. The second way the Nazis tried to get unemployment down was through conscription and rearmament. Now, if you conscript someone, you get them to become a part of the army. If you rearm, then you start to develop mass amounts of weaponry. So the Nazis began rearmament and conscription, which broke the Treaty of Versailles, remember, because the Treaty of Versailles said they weren't allowed any more than 100,000 men in their army. And in 1935, the Nazis introduced conscription for 18 to 25-year-olds, which meant that the army grew to 1.4 million by 1939. Spending on weapons and equipment rose from 3.5 billion to 26 billion marks, causing a big need for workers. So the push for weapons meant a push in the amount of workers that they needed. So that, for example, by 1935, over 72,000 workers were involved in aircraft construction. So that in itself is going to lower the amount of people who are unemployed. Public works and autobahn. So the autobahn, the motorway project, was a key method to reducing unemployment. The Nazis planned to build 7,000 miles of motorway to improve transportation. And by 1935, there were 125,000 men who were building new autobahns within Germany. The Nazis didn't just have this as their only public work. They spent over 38 billion marks a year by 1938 on public works, like schools, hospitals, and bridges to benefit Germany. These would create jobs which would help the German economy and in turn create more jobs in trade or agriculture. So public works were really important. The more money the Nazis put in, the more jobs that would be available. The invisible unemployment. So the Nazis also cheated unemployment statistics to show the unemployment had dropped. They made it invisible. So women and Jews were forced out of their jobs and they were given to men. They were also not included in the unemployment figures. And those in prisons and concentration camps were taken off unemployment statistics. So the Nazis who had people in prison for political reasons or or their own background, then they were taken off the unemployment statistics. Part-time workers were also classed as full-time workers, while soldiers were also workers, even in times of peace. So that army growing to 1.4 million took a big chunk out of the 6 million that were unemployed in Germany. To the overall results, the Nazis claimed they solved unemployment and proudly announced that unemployment had dropped from 4.8 million at the end of 1933 to 300,000 by 1939. The Nazis successfully delivered their promise of bringing work to the German people. However, it needs to be understood that the Nazis did manipulate the system by sacking workers, lying about statistics, and also using forced labor as a method of work. So now that we've done this, we now need to look at the standard of living. So what was the standard of living like for workers in Germany? Now, Hitler knew he had to keep the German workers happy because they were the base of his support. Remember, when Hitler was trying to come to power, he realized that actually he needed to win the workers over because they mainly supported the communists. So Hitler needed to set up organizations to improve the lives of workers, and then we're going to make sort of an understanding of whether their lives did benefit under the Nazis. So the first thing the Nazis set up was something called the German Labour Front, the DAF. Now, this was basically the Nazi trade union, but when Hitler came to power, he banned all trade unions thanks to the Enabling Act in 1933. He replaced it with the German Labour Front to protect workers' rights. All workers had to join or they basically were not allowed to work. So the changes that the DAF introduced were that strikes were made illegal and anyone that was caught striking would be sent to a concentration camp. Workers couldn't ask for higher wages. Workers could not leave a job without permission, and working hours were increased to 60 plus hours a week. However, wages were increased by 20%. So effectively, the freedom of the workers was taken away. This was another form of control from the Nazis, but the Nazis did increase wages. The Nazis did sort of represent the people, and because the Nazis had this method of manipulation, a lot of workers continued accepting what was happening. The second method the Nazis introduced was something called the strength through joy. And it was basically a way to provide leisure activities for workers that everybody could afford. It aimed to keep the workers happy so they didn't complain. So there were lots of different things that they introduced. So for example, they could go on cheap holidays. So 2 weeks in Italy would cost 155 marks. The KDF even owned their own cruise ship. So the Strength Through Joy even had their own ship to take people away. A ski trip cost 1 week's wages, so it made it a lot more accessible for the people of Germany to go on holidays that they couldn't have done before because of the Depression. Over 7 million people took part in Strength Through Joy sport events. So whilst over 10 million went on holiday, so basically the most loyal workers got the best holidays. But the key thing is all of these events were Nazi controlled. So the Nazis would attend the holidays. The Nazis would choose the types of theatre performances you watch. The Nazis would have some view of you during these sporting events. So free evening classes were offered in cookery, and cultural nights like plays, the theatre and films were popular. But remember, theatre and films were both heavily manipulated by propaganda. And then another way to keep the workers happy was by introducing the Volkswagen scheme, where workers would pay 5 marks a week. And once they reached a certain amount, I believe it was 800 marks, they would get their car. However, no car was ever made as the factories focused on rearmament and the people's savings went into rearming Germany. And the reason they didn't sort of speak up was because of fear. And if you have a look at that table there down the side, it shows the amount of million people that are now getting involved in these events, which means the Nazis not only keep people happy, but they keep them under their control. The third and final thing the Nazis introduced to try and improve the lives of the workers is something called the beauty of labour. The beauty of labour campaigned to improve better facilities for the workers, so like better toilets, changing rooms, showers, hot meals in the canteen. Now, the beauty of labour gave factories money to improve their buildings and safety. So, for example, reducing noise level and improving lighting in factories. However, The main people that did this work were the workers, and they didn't get any extra money for it. Okay. So did the workers benefit under the Nazis? I mean, I haven't mentioned a few people here. So like farmers who, you know, had their debts written off, shop owners, so the smaller shop owners benefited because the large supermarkets or large superstores were closed. But what you've got here is reasons why people did benefit and did not benefit. So even though wages went up, the prices of goods rose by 20%, so the increase was cancelled out. Lower earners, like those on the RAD, struggled to buy goods. Working hours increased from 43 to 49 a week. The DAF completely took away German workers' rights for strike, for pay, and to leave their jobs. Women and Jews were sacked from their jobs, and workers were forced to work in poor jobs on the RAD. Some workers did benefit. For example, there were more working people, which meant people had more money to spend, which would increase the standard of living. Wages did increase by 20%, but no, that was counteracted later on due to the price raises. Strength through joy offered workers opportunities that they wouldn't have had before, for example, holidays and leisure that they could never afford, whilst the beauty of labour improved working conditions. And the German workers got the two things they were promised: work and bread. All right, the last two lessons then we've got here is firstly treatment of minorities. So Nazi persecution of minorities, which will lead us into looking at Nazi persecution of Jews, which will then lead you to being caught up fully for your return to school. So Nazi persecution of minorities. Once in power, the Nazis began to slowly persecute and discriminate against the minorities of Germany: Jews, disabled, gypsies, homosexuals, and social outcasts. But why did they do this? It was all down to the Nazi racial beliefs. Central to the Nazi ideology were racial purity, the idea that German race was the master race, and all other Jews were seen as subhuman, Untermenschen. The Nazis believed that Germans were a pure race of Aryans, blonde hair, blue-eyed, athletic, physically fit people. And Hitler believed that Germany's future was basically dependent on the creation of a pure Aryan race, which would be achieved with breeding more Aryans and destroying the Jews and other subhumans that could weaken their master race. Now, the Nazis believed that obviously ideal Germans were socially useful to the Nazis. Therefore, those who didn't work or those who were racially impure were seen as worthless. They weren't part of the people's community, which was known as the Volksgemeinschaft. So there's three groups you've got here. We're going to look at the Jews on the other slide, but three groups here of groups that were persecuted. But how were they persecuted? So you've got the disabled. 1933, the Nazis passed a sterilization law which forcibly sterilized the mentally ill, alcoholic, deaf, blind, or deformed. 400,000 people were sterilized by the start of the war in 1939. Also in 1939, the Nazis started the T4 program, which was a euthanasia program where young people with mental and physical disabilities were killed by starvation or lethal injection. And this led to over 5,000 children being killed. Remember when we did the education aspect, the Nazi textbooks, actually their maths questions talked about how easy it would be to remove disabled people. How much would it cost? How much would you save by removing this group of people? So again, it's that forcible manipulation. For homosexuals, the Nazis believed they were immoral and lowered racial purity. And in 1935, the Nazis passed laws against homosexuality, with 4,000 being arrested in 1936. And roughly over 5,000 homosexuals were sent to concentration camps by the Nazis. And gypsy travelers, they were non-Aryan and a threat to racial purity that needed to be cleansed. They were seen as work shy, so they didn't fit the Nazi life of being socially useful. Germans and gypsies could not marry, and between 36 to 39, Germany's 35,000 gypsies were rounded up and put into camps to be deported eventually. That's the Nazi persecution of minorities. The last group we need to look at in a bit more depth is the Nazi persecution towards Jews. Now, it did escalate pretty quickly. All right. And what we need to understand is, though, that there was only 1% of the population in Germany that were Jews, 437,000. Hitler made it clear, though, that anti-Semitic actions were a priority. And from 1933, when Hitler came to power, it increasingly got worse. At times, it did drop off. For example, in the Olympic Games, the Nazis hid all of the Jewish persecution so that people didn't get suspicious. So we'll quickly just go through each of these, and then that's everything you need to catch up before we head back to school. So on the 1st of April 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses, which meant that the Nazis encouraged people to not go to Jewish people's shops. It was for one day. The SA stood outside Jewish businesses to prevent customers from entering. Jude and the Star of David are painting on the windows to identify a Jewish person's business. Also in 1933, Jews are banned from public places like swimming pools and parks, and they lose all of their government jobs. By 1935, the Nazis introduced the Nuremberg laws, which stated that Jews were no longer German citizens, which meant they could not vote anymore. And also the law for the protection of German blood and honor, which made marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans illegal. By 1936, Jews were banned from working as doctors, dentists, and lawyers. But remember, in 36, you also had the Olympics, which slowed down persecution to make sure people weren't suspicious. By 38, Jews had to register all of their possessions, making it easier for the Nazis to take off them. And they also had to carry ID cards by July 1938. November 1938 was a big turning point because this was one of the worst violent actions towards the Jewish population, known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. There was an event which happened in Paris where a Nazi diplomat, a Nazi government worker, was killed in Paris by a young Jewish boy called Herschel Grynszpan. Goebbels used it as an opportunity for the most violent anti-Jewish attack to date, destroying 7,500 businesses, burning 400 synagogues down, and sending 20,000 Jewish people to the concentration camps, with 100 being killed. Jews are then blamed for this event and are forced to pay $1 billion for the damage. This was the turning point in persecution for the Jews. By December 1938, Jewish people are banned from owning shops. April 1938, Jews could be evicted from their homes without reason. And then also November 1939, Jews were kicked out of school. All right. But in total, between the years 33 to 39, 250,000 Jewish people left Germany to flee the persecution. But the original plan was to deport the Jews. But obviously, as we know, after 1939, the events became a lot more serious, a lot more violent, and did lead to the final solution, the Holocaust. Right, so that's all we need then, year 11. For you to have a keep up activity, that's what we need there. You to go through each of these events and do a spider diagram to keep you up with the level of learning that we've been doing while you've been away. Thanks very much.